She didn't scream when they pushed her off the cart. She just clutched her shawl tighter, landing hard in the slush. One glance back, and the wheels were already churning away, muddying the road as if she'd never been there. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, knees soaked, fingers trembling. But no one was listening. Ruth was 18, unmarried, and 6 months along. Her employer, a merchant's widow from Surrey, had promised to care for her in exchange for silence about whose child it was. But when her belly began to show and the village women started asking questions, the widow arranged one final delivery to a home far outside Devon. They left at sunrise. By midday, she'd been discarded like spoiled milk at a crossroads that wasn't even marked. The snow was still falling, soft but steady, and she could already feel the damp creeping through her boots. She stood slowly, spine aching, eyes scanning the barren hedgerows. No cottages in sight, no sounds but wind and birds. She wrapped her arms around her belly, whispering to the child inside, "It's just us now, love. Just us." She started walking, one hand dragging against the hedgerow for balance. Her steps were slow. She fell once, then again. By the time the light began to fade, her skin was raw and her legs numb. The road curved sharply, and there, like something out of a half-remembered story, stood a man cloaked in wool, crouched by the edge of a stream. He rose when he saw her, dark hair falling past his ears, a carved staff in one hand. Ruth stopped, dazed. "I'm not begging," she rasped. The man frowned, then crossed the road in 3 long strides. "You'll freeze," he said. His voice wasn't cruel, just certain. "Where were you headed?" "Nowhere," she whispered. "That's exactly where I am." He pulled the heavy cloak from his shoulders and draped it around her without asking. It smelled of moss and wood smoke. "Then we'll go somewhere," he said. "You'll not die here." She woke by a hearth, her boots gone, her feet wrapped in cloth. The smell of broth filled the room, and the sound of logs cracking softly in the grate eased her heart before her eyes opened. It was a cottage, modest, dark timbered, walls lined with books and herbs, not the kind of place she'd have ever been allowed to enter while in service. And yet, there she was, stretched out on a straw-stuffed bed beneath a wool blanket. The man sat on a low stool nearby, mending a tear in his sleeve by firelight. He noticed her stir but didn't rush her with questions. "I thought you might not wake," he said. "Your hands were blue." Ruth tried to sit up but winced at the tightness in her belly. "Where am I?" "A scout's post," he said simply. "South end of the forest of Dean. You walked nearly a mile off the road, foolish and brave." "I didn't have a map," she muttered. "Didn't have a choice." He nodded like that made perfect sense. "I'm called Will." He didn't offer more. She liked that. She sat up slowly, the blanket sliding from her shoulders, revealing the curve of her stomach. Will didn't stare. He didn't look away either. Just acknowledged it with a slight nod. "You're safe here, for as long as you need." Ruth hesitated. "You don't know who I am." "You're someone they threw out," he said. "That's all I need to know." The fire popped sharply. She tightened the blanket around her and looked at the window where the snow still whispered against the glass. "They said I was a ruin," she said, "that I'd bring shame." Will stirred the broth without replying. "You want soup?" "I want to believe someone," she said, "and I don't know if I can anymore." He handed her the bowl with both hands. "Then start small. Believe that you won't freeze. Believe that there's soup. Believe that I don't care where you came from." She took the bowl, trembling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, "I'm Ruth." And for the first time in months, saying her name felt like claiming something instead of confessing. He didn't smile. He just bowed his head. "Then you're Ruth, and this is shelter, and we begin there." For 3 days she barely spoke. Will didn't press her. He moved through the cottage like a man used to quiet, tending the fire, fetching water from the frozen stream, stitching old coats, brewing teas that smelled of nettles and something ancient. Ruth watched him from the chair by the hearth, legs wrapped in blankets, hands resting on her belly like anchors. He didn't ask what happened, didn't prod for names or confessions. But every night, he placed a fresh pot of tea beside her, checked the cloth around her feet, and left his own cloak folded within reach. On the 3rd evening, she found herself saying aloud, "The father was a merchant's son. He said he loved me." Will didn't react, just continued sorting herbs by the shelf. "When I told him, he left for London the next day. His mother said I'd shamed them. She made me sleep in the cellar and took my wages. When I began to show, she hired a cart." She paused, fingers tightening. "Said it was a place for girls like me." Will glanced at her. "There's no such place. Only places for people who believe lies." She blinked. "You believe me?" "I don't need to," he said plainly. "You're here. That's what matters." The weight of that landed heavy, sweet, and unbearable. She hadn't been just believed, she'd been accepted without proof. "Why do you live here?" she asked. "Alone?" He hesitated, then sat across from her. "I was a scout in the last border skirmish, Highland raids. I saw too much, did too much, came back, and didn't quite fit anymore." "So you ran?" "I walked away," he corrected. "Built something that doesn't take from others. Not anymore." She looked around the small cottage, the fire, the books, the stillness. "It's quiet." "Quiet's not the same as empty," he said. She looked down at her stomach, the baby shifting within her. "It won't stay quiet for long." "Then it changes," he said. "That's what places like this are meant to do." That night, she curled on the bed with the cloak around her shoulders, the fire flickering soft against the stone, and for the first time in months, she didn't dream of running or falling or freezing. She dreamed of a room where someone stayed. By the 7th day, she was helping with the fire. Her legs still ached, her toes still blistered, but Ruth insisted on doing something. Will handed her kindling without argument and showed her how to stack the logs so they burned longer. "It's like building a spine," he said, "strongest in the middle." She didn't reply, but her hands remembered. In the merchant's house, she'd built fires before sunrise, swept ashes before others even opened their doors. But this felt different. No one barking orders, no one watching her like she might steal a crust of bread. That evening, she peeled potatoes while he salted venison. It was the first time she'd laughed. Just once, when the pot nearly toppled and he caught it with a surprised grunt. The sound startled both of them. "You've a good laugh," he said. "You should use it more." "I forgot I had one," she admitted. "Feels strange." Strange things are worth keeping. She looked at him then, longer than before. "Do people come here often?" He shook his head. "No one stumbles this deep unless they mean to vanish." "So I'm the first?" "In a while. And if someone came asking about me," he paused, "I'd ask if they were kind. If they weren't, I'd say I'd never heard the name." She looked down at her belly. "What if I told you I haven't picked a name yet?" Will leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "Then start with your own. Everything else will follow." That night, she stayed up by the hearth while he slept nearby, breathing steady, wrapped in a second cloak. She traced her name into the ash on the stone floor, Ruth. Then beside it, smaller, Will. Not as a pairing, not yet. Just as two names that existed in the same warm place. The baby kicked. She whispered to the fire, "We're not alone anymore, little one." In the morning, she woke to a tin cup by her side and a note scribbled on rough parchment. "Let the fire warm you before the day does." No one had written her a note in years. It was nothing. It was everything. She folded it gently and tucked it beneath her blanket. The first kindness she would keep. It was the sound of hooves that shook her first. Not loud, not fast. Just the steady clop of a lone rider outside the cottage. Ruth froze mid-stir as the stew bubbled on the fire. Will rose silently, hand resting near the axe on the wall, and stepped to the window. "Courier," he said quietly, "from the south." Ruth's breath caught. "Looking for me?" Will shook his head. "Wrong kind of boots. This one's been riding farm to farm." He opened the door just enough to speak. A stout woman in a heavy riding coat sat atop a mottled horse. "You Will of the Forest?" He nodded. "I'm called by that when needed. Your neighbor to the east said you've got a woman in trouble here. Name Ruth?" Ruth stepped into view, jaw set. "Not in trouble, just pregnant." The rider blinked, then smiled faintly. "Then I've found who I'm after. I'm called Meg. I deliver babies and sometimes bad news. Thought I'd best offer the first before the second comes." Will stepped aside, and Ruth ushered her in, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Meg removed her coat and set down a satchel filled with vials and cloth. "I don't mean to pry," she said, glancing at Ruth's belly, "but there's a tightness in your stance. You've been cold too long." Ruth nodded. "Fever's past, but the kicks are strong now. Some nights I feel like I've two hearts beating." Meg laid a palm gently over her abdomen, then closed her eyes. "Girl," she said, "or stubborn boy. Either way, soon." Ruth blinked. "You can tell that?" "Only by how brave the mother's trying to be." Will stood behind them, silent but steady. "You'll stay?" he asked. Meg nodded. "If you've got broth and patience, I'll see it through." That night they ate together, the scout, the girl, the midwife. Ruth watched their faces in the flickering firelight and thought, "This is not what I imagined survival would look like. It was better, softer, a little noisy, a little strange, but good." Later, when the cottage had quieted and the wind hummed against the windows, Ruth whispered to the baby, "You'll be born where the world tried to bury us." She rested her hand over her stomach and smiled. "But we'll make sure you bloom." The labor began with a dull ache low in her back, the kind that made her pause mid-step and grip the edge of the table. She said nothing at first, just pressed her lips together and kept peeling the root vegetables. But Meg saw. "Set that down, love," she said. "You've crossed into it now." Will stiffened, rising from his place by the door. "Now?" Ruth nodded, jaw clenched. "It's time." The next hours passed like waves, some gentle, some thrashing. Meg took command of the cottage with a quiet certainty that reminded Ruth of a general, not a healer. Blankets were boiled, water fetched. Will chopped wood as if the rhythm of his axe could distract him from the sounds within. Ruth labored without screams, just breathing, low and tight, her fists clenched in the wool of Will's old cloak. "You're doing it," Meg whispered between contractions. "Not for them, not for forgiveness, just for you and her." "Her?" Ruth panted. "You're sure?" "No," Meg said, smiling, "but I like saying her. Feels right." Outside, the snow had long melted into spring's grey slush. The forest dripped gently, branches bowed with morning mist. Inside, Ruth gritted her teeth through the last push, sweat beading on her brow, her breath one long exhale that ended in a single sound, her daughter's first cry. It sliced the air like a blade of light, sharp, alive. Ruth collapsed backward, eyes wide with shock and wonder. She's here." Meg placed the child on her chest, still slick, still red, lungs stronger than her size. Ruth wept, without sound, stroking the baby's downy hair. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We made it." Will stood in the doorway, unsure if he belonged in this moment. Meg glanced at him. She'll want you close, just not hovering. He nodded and stepped into the room, kneeling beside the bed without touching. Ruth looked at him through tears. She's perfect. So is her mother, he said softly. The baby's cries softened into hiccups and tiny fists. Ruth kissed her brow and whispered, We'll name you Elsie. After no one, just you. And as the sun climbed past the treetops and spilled into the cottage, Ruth finally slept, not from exhaustion, but from peace. Her world was no longer waiting to collapse. It had already begun. The next morning smelled of bread. Ruth woke to it, blinking against the soft morning light that spilled through the cottage window. She thought for a moment it was a dream, the quiet, the warmth, the rise and fall of Elsie's breath against her chest. But when she looked up, she saw Will bent over the hearth, awkwardly turning a lump of dough in the pan, his brow furrowed in concentration. You're burning it, she croaked. He turned, startled. You're awake. And you're trying to kill us with smoke. Meg said you needed rest, he muttered. I thought bread might help. She smiled, weak but sure. You thought right. Meg appeared moments later, hair pinned up, sleeves rolled. He's useless with yeast, she muttered, plucking the pan from his hands. But kind-hearted, that counts. Ruth sat up slowly, Elsie still asleep at her side. I don't know what I'd have done without either of you. You'd have managed, Meg said, handing her a crusty corner. Women always do. Will set a cup of tea beside the bed, the steam curling into the light. The road's still quiet, he said. No one's come asking. They won't, Ruth said, more certain than she expected. The world that sent me away doesn't care what became of me. She paused, looking down at Elsie's tiny hand curled like a question mark. But I do. Meg stirred something at the stove. You've got choices now. Stay here. Go elsewhere. Either way, you're no longer waiting to be chosen. Ruth looked around the room. The fire, the books, the blankets stacked neatly by the door. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. I think I'd like to stay, she said, if there's room. Will met her eyes, and for a moment neither spoke. Then he nodded. There's always been room. You just hadn't claimed it yet. That afternoon, Ruth stepped outside for the first time in weeks, feet slow but steady. The trees whispered in the wind. Birds flitted through the branches. The path behind the cottage was still damp, but flowers were starting to push through. She turned back toward the door, where Will stood holding Elsie, awkward and careful, as if she were made of glass. You're holding her wrong, Ruth called. He grinned. She's still breathing, isn't she? And for the first time, the three of them stood in sunlight, whole. They buried her name beneath the silence. No one in Ruth's former village ever spoke it again. Not the widow who had employed her, not the merchant's son who'd vanished into London's fog. When a stranger once passed through and asked if anyone remembered a girl who'd served at the back of the drapery shop, they shrugged. She left. Likely didn't last the winter. And that was how they told themselves the story ended. But they were wrong. Ruth had not perished. She had simply rewritten the story where they had chosen to end it. Spring passed into early summer, and with Meg's help, the cottage grew into something more. A cradle was carved from alderwood. Herbs were hung from the beams. Ruth began collecting feathers and moss for bedding, insisting Elsie sleep on nothing rougher than clouds. When Meg rode on to her next berth, she left behind a bundle of supplies, a note scribbled in thick charcoal. You're a mother now, and more than that. Don't forget either part. Ruth hung the note by the hearth. Will built a second chair beside the window and placed it so it caught the morning light. You sit here, he said, while I forget how to make bread properly. Some evenings she read aloud from the worn books on the shelf. Elsie's eyes followed the rhythm of her voice. Will listened in silence, carving quietly by the fire. He never asked Ruth to stay, and Ruth never asked if he wished she would. But one night, as thunder rolled in the distance, he handed her a pouch, small, leather, stitched with patience. Inside was a carved token, a circle wrapped in thorns and stars. A home, he said simply, if you want it. She closed her hand around it. I already chose that. This just makes it real. That night she watched Elsie sleep, her fingers curled against her chest like she was still reaching for the world that had once tried to forget her. Ruth leaned down, kissed her daughter's brow and whispered, "You will be known, even if I never was." But deep down, she no longer feared being forgotten, because here, in this place of fire and moss and carved tokens, someone knew her, not as the girl they cast out, but as the woman who survived. It began with one knock at the door, a woman with soot on her cheeks and 2 children in tow. She didn't give her name, only said she'd heard about a place near the ridge where no one asked questions. Ruth glanced at Will, who simply stepped aside and said, "You'll want the cot near the window." They didn't speak much that night, but the woman cried softly while her children slept, and Ruth left a cup of broth near her bed without a word. 2 weeks later, another came. Then 3. A girl no older than 16 with bruises on her wrists. An older man who'd worked the mines until his lungs gave out. Each one arrived like a shadow from a life Ruth had once known, and each one was welcomed not as a burden, but as proof that kindness still rippled through the world, even in silence. Will built bunks along the back wall. Ruth made extra loaves. By midsummer, the cottage was no longer just a shelter. It was a refuge, a place for the thrown away, the unseen, the exiled. Some stayed a night, others stayed for seasons, but all left something behind, a story, a name, a scrap of truth that could live outside shame. Ruth kept a ledger, not with coins, but with first names. She wrote them on parchment and tucked them in a wooden box by the fire. "So the world doesn't forget," she told Elsie, now babbling and teetering on chubby legs. "So you'll know we mattered." One evening, as they all sat around the hearth, 12 souls warmed by the same flame, a voice asked Ruth, "What made you start all this?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up Elsie, cradled her close, and looked to Will, who was whittling quietly beside the fire. "I was left in the snow," she said. "I could have vanished, but someone wrapped me in a cloak and gave me back my breath." She looked around the room, at faces once hardened by grief, now softened by firelight. "So now we pass that breath on, one cloak at a time." No one clapped, no one cheered, but the silence that followed was full of memory, of meaning, of the kind of love that didn't demand to be named, only shared. Years passed, but the cloak never left its place by the door. It hung there through summers and winters, through births and farewells, worn at the edges but whole, like Ruth herself. By the time Elsie could read, she already knew the story by heart. Not the one about her father, or the village that cast Ruth out, but the real story, of a woman who nearly froze in silence until a quiet man gave her warmth with no strings, no shame. They had never spoken vows, Ruth and Will, but they had built something sturdier than any binding could offer. Trust, shared hands, a life woven from ordinary days and stubborn hope. One morning, while Elsie pressed wildflowers between pages and Will chopped wood, a young woman arrived on the path. Alone, pale, with red-rimmed eyes and a knapsack that looked heavier than she could carry. She didn't knock, just stood there, uncertain. Ruth stepped outside, still in her apron, wiping flour from her palms. "You've come far," she said gently. The girl nodded. "I don't know where else to go." Ruth gestured toward the door. Then, "You're exactly where you need to be." That evening, the girl sat by the fire, the same fire Ruth had once woken beside, and held a bowl of broth with shaking hands. Elsie curled beside her mother, whispering, "Will she stay?" Ruth smoothed her daughter's hair. "As long as she needs." Later, when the others were asleep and the cottage had quieted, Ruth took the cloak from its peg. She brushed the dust from the seams and folded it carefully, then placed it in the girl's arms as she slept. It was no longer hers to wear, but it was hers to pass on. In the morning the girl found the cloak waiting. She looked to Ruth, eyes wide. "I can't take this." "You already have," Ruth said softly. "The night you crossed the last bridge and chose to live." The girl began to cry. Ruth didn't stop her. She simply stood there, hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a witness to the moment the cold lost another soul. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-stirring stories of strength, kindness, and healing, right here on Echoes of England. If you had found her in the snow, would you have wrapped her in your cloak too? Tell us in the comments.